The year is 1945. Churchill has just delivered Britain from the brink of Nazi conquest, sporting approval ratings that would make today's politicians weep with envy. He's so confident of victory that he plans to pop home briefly from the Potsdam Conference just to accept his inevitable win. Then July 26th happened. A massive 72.8% voter turnout delivers a verdict that shocks the world. Labour wins 393 seats to the Conservatives' 197. A swing so dramatic it represents the largest shift since the Acts of Union in 1800. But here's the thing about that shocking result. The clues were scattered throughout the voting data all along, waiting for someone to piece them together. The numbers that everyone missed. Those clues reveal themselves when you examine the actual polling data that political observers had access to throughout 1945. By February of that year, Labour held an 18-point lead over the Conservatives in national polling, a massive advantage that persisted for months before the election. Yet the political establishment dismissed these numbers as unreliable wartime anomalies, failing to recognize what the data was screaming at them. The 72.8% turnout wasn't randomly distributed across Britain's constituencies. Working-class areas in the industrial north reached turnout rates approaching 80%, while rural constituencies and upper-middle-class districts struggled to hit 65%. Northern mining communities that had supported conservative candidates through the 1930s were registering swings of 15 to 20 percentage points in local elections throughout 1944. The Midlands industrial belt showed similar patterns, with constituency-level results pointing toward a Labour surge that would have dominated political headlines if anyone had been paying attention. Churchill's 83% approval rating becomes far less impressive when you separate personal admiration from voting intention. Nearly 40% of respondents who approved of Churchill's wartime leadership planned to vote Labour anyway. This split between personal popularity and party preference was hiding in plain sight within the polling cross-tabulations, but 1940s political analysis lacked the sophistication to detect it. The demographic breakdown tells an even clearer story. The C to D social grades, skilled manual workers, semi-skilled workers, and the unemployed were abandoning conservative candidates at unprecedented rates. Men who had served in the armed forces and returned home to unemployment queues were breaking for Labour by margins approaching 70%. Women aged 30 to 50 who had worked in munitions factories and experienced economic independence during the war were moving toward Labour candidates by similar percentages. Regional analysis exposes another layer of predictability that was staring political observers in the face. Southern suburban constituencies, where middle management voters lived, showed the most dramatic reversals, with conservative majorities evaporating in local elections throughout 1944 and early 1945. These weren't sudden shifts. They were gradual movements that accelerated as the war drew to a close and domestic concerns took precedence over military leadership. The class-based voting patterns were shifting beneath the surface in ways that should have been obvious to anyone tracking the data systematically. Upper-class constituencies maintained conservative loyalty at rates around 85%, exactly what historical patterns would predict. But middle-class suburban areas began splitting almost evenly between parties, while working-class districts moved toward Labour at rates not seen since the party's formation. Industrial workers who had witnessed government coordination succeed during wartime production were supporting government intervention in peacetime economics. Rural laborers who had experienced regulated agricultural production during the war backed similar policies for peacetime farming. These occupational voting patterns followed economic self-interest calculations that were visible in union membership data and local election results throughout 1944. The most telling indicator was hiding within the demographic cross-tabulations of early 1945 polling. Returning servicemen who had experienced different social structures in military settings were rejecting traditional conservative hierarchies at rates approaching 65%. Young couples struggling with housing shortages in bomb-damaged cities were abandoning conservative candidates in numbers that should have triggered alarm bells at conservative central office. Age cohort analysis reveals the most dramatic pattern. Voters aged 25 to 45 were shifting away from conservative candidates at rates that began appearing in local by-elections throughout 1944. This wasn't a sudden wartime emotion. It was a sustained demographic realignment that had been building for over a year before the general election. The 10.7% swing from Conservative to Labour represents one of the largest electoral shifts in British political history. But the components of that swing were visible months before July 1945. Labour's focus on housing, employment, and social services was generating positive responses among precisely the demographic groups that were participating in elections at higher rates than ever before. High turnout almost always signals anti-incumbent sentiment, particularly when combined with increased participation among previously disengaged voter segments. Young working-class voters who had never participated in elections before were registering to vote at rates that should have been interpreted as a clear regime change signal. The 73% turnout figure itself was telling the story. This wasn't a normal election with normal pattern. Those massive swing margins that shocked political observers follow patterns that were entirely predictable based on the available data. When you track the local election results, by-election swings, union membership patterns, and demographic shifts that were occurring throughout 1944 and early 1945, Labour's victory becomes not just probable, but inevitable. The fundamental disconnect between Churchill's messaging and voter priorities was evident in the polling data months before campaign season began. His continued focus on international threats and military preparedness was falling flat among precisely the demographic groups that were driving the high turnout numbers. Meanwhile, Labour's emphasis on domestic reconstruction was resonating with voters who had moved beyond wartime concerns to peacetime priority. The election outcome was hiding in plain sight within the demographic data that political observers had access to but failed to interpret correctly. The patterns were there: the massive Labour polling leads, the demographic shifts, the regional swings, the class-based realignment. What wasn't there was a political establishment capable of recognizing that Britain itself had fundamentally changed during 6 years of total war, and that the man who had guided them through that transformation might not be the right leader for what came next. Churchill's aristocratic blind spot, Churchill's privileged upbringing at Blenheim Palace, created an invisible wall between him and the Britain that emerged from 6 years of total war. Born into the aristocratic Spencer Churchill family, with his mother Jenny Jerome bringing American railroad fortune into the mix, Winston grew up in a world of servants, grand estates, and inherited privilege that left him fundamentally disconnected from how ordinary people actually live. This aristocratic bubble became politically fatal when Britain's class structure began shifting beneath his feet. Yet Churchill's early life wasn't entirely cushioned from hardship. He struggled academically at Harrow, failed the entrance exam to Sandhurst twice, and spent years as a young cavalry officer in India earning modest military pay. His early political career included periods in the wilderness, battling depression and financial difficulties while opposing his own party's appeasement policies throughout the 1930s. These experiences should have grounded him in ordinary struggle, but his fundamental worldview remained shaped by inherited wealth and social position rather than earned income or economic uncertainty. The lived experience of ordinary Britons during and after the war created expectations that Churchill's aristocratic background prevented him from understanding. Factory workers who'd produced munitions under government coordination saw firsthand how organized planning could achieve remarkable results. Yet Churchill continued advocating for traditional free market approaches that felt abstract and disconnected from their wartime reality. Women who'd entered previously male-dominated industries discovered economic independence, only to face post-war unemployment as men returned from military service. These voters wanted leaders who understood their economic anxieties from personal experience, not theoretical policy positions developed in palace drawing rooms. Working-class voters were sharing stories about aristocratic politicians who seemed oblivious to housing shortages, food rationing, and employment uncertainty. Churchill's continued references to imperial glory and military tradition felt tone-deaf among demographic groups focused on domestic economic security and social advancement. His wartime speeches that rallied Britain during its darkest hours began sounding increasingly inappropriate as victory approached. His rhetoric about blood, toil, tears, and sweat resonated powerfully when German bombers threatened London nightly. but felt disconnected from voters planning peacetime lives around housing, employment, and family security. The demographic data reveals just how dramatically class voting patterns were shifting during this period. Upper-class constituencies maintained conservative loyalty at roughly 85%, exactly what political modeling would predict based on economic self-interest calculation. However, middle-class suburban areas that had supported conservative candidates throughout the 1930s began splitting almost evenly between parties, while working-class industrial districts moved toward Labour at rates approaching 70%. These demographic shifts follow patterns that electoral analysis recognizes as fundamental regime change signals. Yet Churchill's aristocratic circle remained oblivious to the transformation happening beneath their feet. Churchill's own Conservative Party failed to understand the changing electoral landscape because they shared similar privileged backgrounds that insulated them from voter concerns. Party strategists focused on Churchill's personal popularity ratings while ignoring the demographic trends that campaign analytics monitor constantly. They assumed that wartime leadership success would automatically translate into peacetime electoral victory, missing the distinction between crisis management and domestic governance that political science recognizes as fundamentally different skill sets requiring different voter coalition. Meanwhile, Clement Attlee had been quietly demonstrating exactly the kind of competence that voters were seeking. As Deputy Prime Minister in Churchill's wartime coalition, Attlee managed the home front with remarkable efficiency, coordinating domestic policy while Churchill focused on military strategy and international diplomacy. His role as Lord President of the Council and later as Deputy Prime Minister gave him direct responsibility for domestic reconstruction planning, social services coordination, and economic policy implementation. Where Churchill excelled at inspiring rhetoric and strategic vision, Attlee proved himself capable of practical governance and administrative competence. Churchill was fighting the last war politically, applying wartime leadership approaches to peacetime electoral competition in ways that campaign strategy recognizes as fundamentally flawed. His aristocratic instincts led him to emphasize tradition, hierarchy, and established authority at exactly the moment when voters wanted change, opportunity, and social mobility. The Conservative Party's campaign approach reflected aristocratic assumptions about voter behavior that electoral analysis has thoroughly debunked. They believed that personal respect for Churchill would automatically extend to party support, missing the sophisticated distinctions that polling routinely measures between leadership approval and voting intention. The class-based resentment building against aristocratic leadership appears clearly in voting analysis that processes 1945 data through demographic filters. Industrial workers were rejecting traditional conservative arguments about social hierarchy and inherited privilege at rates that would trigger every early warning system. Young voters entering the electorate for the first time showed even stronger anti-aristocratic sentiment, supporting Labour candidates by margins that polling would have recognized as generational political realignment. Churchill's aristocratic blind spot prevented him from recognizing that Britain's wartime experience had fundamentally altered voter expectations about social mobility and economic opportunity. His privileged background made it impossible for him to understand that voters wanted leaders who shared their economic anxieties rather than inherited wealth and social position. Aristocratic leadership was becoming politically toxic in post-war Britain, as social hierarchies that had survived for centuries began collapsing under the weight of shared wartime sacrifice and economic transformation. Churchill represented the old order of inherited privilege and traditional authority at precisely the moment when voters wanted representatives who understood their struggles from personal experience rather than aristocratic observation. The political establishment had completely misjudged what kind of leader Britain needed for peacetime reconstruction, dismissing the very qualities that would prove most valuable in the challenging years ahead. The quiet, revolutionary nobody saw coming. Clement Attlee represented exactly those overlooked qualities. A middle-class lawyer from London who managed charitable organizations in the East End and spoke with all the charisma of a county clerk reading municipal bylaws. The political establishment dismissed him as an unremarkable figure, yet his background provided precisely the experience that post-war Britain required. Attlee had spent his early career running Haileybury House in Limehouse, working directly with impoverished youth in conditions that most politicians observed from comfortable distance. His legal training at University College London and subsequent work with disadvantaged communities gave him practical experience in problem-solving that aristocratic politicians simply couldn't match. Attlee's middle-class background provided him with direct understanding of economic anxiety, housing shortages, and employment uncertainty that affected millions of British voters. His work in Limehouse exposed him to poverty, unemployment, and social problems that required practical solutions rather than inspiring rhetoric. These experiences created the empathy and problem-solving skills that voters prioritized during peacetime transitions. While Churchill's aristocratic background provided crisis leadership abilities that became less relevant once military threats diminished, his rapid rise through local politics demonstrated organizational skills that marked him as having genuine executive potential. His progression from social work to local Labour Party positions to parliamentary leadership required building coalitions, managing diverse personalities, and implementing practical policies that produced measurable results. These achievements indicated superior administrative capabilities compared to Churchill's more individualistic leadership style that depended heavily on personal charisma and rhetorical ability. The most revealing indicator of Attlee's hidden strengths emerged through his management of Britain's home front during World War II while serving as Deputy Prime Minister from 1942 to 1945. Churchill focused on military strategy and international diplomacy, while Attlee handled domestic production, resource allocation, and civilian morale during the war's most challenging periods. This division of labor demonstrated Attlee's superior administrative competence in managing complex bureaucratic systems under extreme pressure. His coordination of wartime production, rationing systems, and civilian services required exactly the skills that peacetime governance demanded. Voter preferences during the 1944-1945 period show how Attlee's quiet leadership style matched exactly what exhausted British voters wanted after 6 years of crisis management. Growing voter fatigue with dramatic rhetoric and inspirational appeals was being replaced by demand for practical problem-solving and competent administration. Attlee's straightforward communication style and focus on concrete policy proposals generated positive responses among demographic groups that found Churchill's continued crisis messaging increasingly irrelevant to their daily concerns about housing, employment, and social security. Attlee's authentic approach proved superior to Churchill's theatrical style. Voters consistently respond positively to leaders who demonstrate genuine understanding of their economic concerns through personal experience rather than political positioning. Attlee's background managing charitable organizations and working with disadvantaged populations provided credibility that Churchill's aristocratic upbringing couldn't match. He scored significantly higher on trustworthiness and relatability measures that predict electoral success. His no-nonsense approach would have resonated powerfully with voters frustrated by political theater. His straightforward policy explanations and practical solutions to housing shortages, unemployment, and social services addressed voter concerns in ways that substantive policy content consistently outperforms inspirational messaging. When voters are focused on specific economic concerns rather than existential threat, the contrast between flashy political personalities and substance-focused governance becomes apparent when examining electoral outcomes. Voters routinely reject charismatic candidates who lack practical governing experience in favor of less exciting politicians who demonstrate administrative competence. Attlee's methodical approach to policy implementation and his ability to work effectively within bureaucratic systems provided exactly the skills crucial for successful governance during periods of major social transition. Political establishments consistently underestimate candidates because they mistake charisma for leadership ability and confuse media attention with electoral appeal. Attlee's quiet competence didn't generate newspaper headlines or dramatic radio moments, leading political observers to dismiss his electoral potential despite clear evidence of his administrative achievement. His practical problem-solving experience represented a significant electoral advantage among voters prioritizing domestic policy over international drama. Introverted personalities often excel at building consensus and implementing complex policy changes that require sustained administrative focus rather than dramatic public gestures. Attlee's collective approach to cabinet management allowed his ministers to contribute expertise while maintaining clear decision-making authority that produced remarkably efficient policy implementation. This leadership style proved particularly effective for managing the complex transition from wartime to peacetime governance that Britain faced in 1945. Attlee's appeal among precisely the demographic groups that determined the 1945 outcome was evident months before campaign season began. His middle-class background resonated with suburban voters experiencing economic uncertainty, while his social work experience connected with working-class families struggling with housing and employment challenges. These demographic groups were shifting toward candidates who demonstrated practical understanding of their concerns rather than abstract policy positions developed in privileged isolation. The fundamental distinction between crisis leadership and peacetime governance clearly explains why Attlee's administrative skills became more valuable than Churchill's inspirational abilities once military threats diminished. Voters wanted leaders who could organize housing construction, coordinate employment programs, and implement social services efficiently rather than deliver stirring speeches about national destiny. This transition in voter preferences positioned Attlee's practical experience as a significant electoral advantage. George Orwell captured this transformation perfectly in 1945, noting that the election turned on domestic issues rather than war or foreign policy, with a gathering discontent which cannot be fitted into any ism, but which springs from a desire for more dignity and decency in everyday life, more opportunities for the young, and above all, more security. Attlee represented this future-focused approach to democratic leadership, while Churchill remained anchored to past achievements that voters wanted to move beyond rather than extend indefinitely. Yet Attlee's quiet competence alone doesn't fully explain Labour's landslide victory. Something else had captured the British public's imagination during the war years, something that would prove far more influential than any politician's personal appeal. The document that changed everything. That something was a government report that became the publishing sensation of 1942, outselling popular novels and generating more public discussion than Churchill's latest wartime address. The Beveridge Report, officially titled Social Insurance and Allied Services, moved over 600,000 copies within months of publication, transforming a dry policy document into the most talked-about blueprint for Britain's future that anyone could remember. Government reports typically gathered dust in bureaucratic offices, read only by civil servants and policy specialists. Yet this particular document sparked conversations in pubs, factories, and family kitchens across the nation with unprecedented intensity. William Beveridge and his mathematician wife Janet had crafted something far more powerful than standard policy recommendations. Their report promised to slay what they termed the 5 giants of want, squalor, ignorance, idleness, and disease through comprehensive social insurance that would protect citizens from the cradle to the grave. The report connected abstract policy proposals to deeply personal fears and aspirations that had intensified during 6 years of wartime sacrifice and uncertainty. Using language that resonated with extraordinary emotional power among ordinary British families, the report spread through British society revealed just how thoroughly it captured public imagination. Factory workers were discussing pension provisions during lunch breaks, while housewives debated healthcare proposals during neighborhood conversations. The overwhelmingly positive responses to the report's promise of security and stability were particularly strong among demographic groups that had experienced economic uncertainty throughout the Depression and wartime disruption. The report's proposals for a national health service that would provide medical care based on citizenship rather than ability to pay generated enthusiasm at levels typically associated with major cultural phenomena. British families who had watched relatives delay medical treatment due to cost saw the NHS proposal as revolutionary rather than merely progressive. The promise of free medical care, regardless of economic status, resonated with extraordinary power among working-class voters who had experienced the anxiety of choosing between health care and household necessity. Social security provisions outlined in the Beveridge Report addressed fears that had haunted British families since the economic collapse of the 1930s. The proposal for unemployment benefits, retirement pensions, and family allowances created a comprehensive safety net that promised to eliminate the economic insecurity that had defined working-class life for generations.